Hi everyone and welcome to the Multivariate EEG Analysis course. My name is Alexis Perez and today I will be teaching and trying to explain how forward encoding models work. Now I'm going to make a brief description of what will be the contents of this part of the course and then we will move to the materials. So now that you have seen my face, I think that it's time to disappear and continue with the presentation. Good. So, what are the forward encoding models? During this course, what we have been doing is to focus on mainly the decoding techniques that exist. One is the classifiers and the other is the representational of similarity analysis. So here I will try to introduce you to the encoding models, which is kind of the opposite of the decoding models. You will see that this technique is very useful, and the objective of this course, of this part of the course, is that you can finally understand what are the conceptual advantages of forward encoding models, what are the difference with the decoding models, and also how they work, right? So I don't think that you will be able to understand completely how they work because it's a little bit complex, but at least what is important is you will be able to understand in what cases they can be beneficial and why. So in the first part, what we will be talking about is what are the different neural codes and neural formats that the brain can use to encode information in the external world, and what are we looking when we are using a decoding or an encoding technique. So from this we will go from very simple concepts to a little bit more abstract. In the second part, that will be for the next class, we will talk about the introduction to the forward encoding models, and we will explain how this forward encoding model works, and we will discuss some practical application and advantages. And in the third part, what we will do is to explain a little bit how the implementation of this modeling technique is accomplished in MATLAB code. So we will briefly go over the code that we will use for the practical session. Okay, let's begin with the fundamental question. How is stimulus information encoded in the brain? To illustrate this, what we can do is to take a practical example. In this case, imagine that you are running an experiment where your participant is looking at a series of stimuli. In this case are oriented bars, also named as gratings, and you record the activity from the visual cortex, and what you want to know is how this activity is related with the external stimuli. So now let's, for example, chunk a little bit the data to see with more detail what we are represented here. So for example, if we take this portion, what we have in the rows are different trials, and these different numbers are representing the orientation of the grating presented in each trial. So for example, in the first trial, the participant is seeing a 113 degrees grating, in the second trial a 100 degrees grating, and so on. And here in the columns, in the x-axis, what we have are different neurons that we are possibly recording from visual cortex. So this is neuron 1, neuron 2, neuron 3. The idea will be that, for example, for the trial number 1, we can record what neuron, the firing rate of neuron 1, the firing rate to neuron 2, the firing rate of neuron 3, okay, and so on. So that means that we can see how each neuron is responding to the different stimuli. So how the information is encoded in the brain. So on the one hand, we have the temporal coding. Temporal coding is something that is very relevant too, and it can take the form of a latency coding. Let's say that different features of the stimulus are coded at different latencies from the onset of the stimulus, or it can be oscillatory, or there is also the phase of the oscillation, what it can encode the stimulus, but we are not going to discuss this. So we are going to move directly to the rate coding, and the rate coding is the most simple one, and it's simply that when you present a stimulus, if the neuron likes this stimulus, it will fire stronger. Okay, so here we have one neuron, and we are stimulating this neuron with different oriented bars. And for example, if we present this like a slightly tilted bar, there will be a very quick response. And then if it's a little bit more tilted vertically, the response is a little bit more vigorous. And when it's completely vertical, we reach like a peak of activity, right? So there is a very strong firing rate. So if we are collecting all these responses through the different stimulus for one neuron, so you can like capture the activity profile of this neuron, and with it we can get the tuning function of the neuron. So what is the preferred orientation of the neuron, how spread is the tuning, so how specific is firing for one orientation or for other orientations. Imagine that is flat. So if it's flat, probably it doesn't have any preference, or maybe it can be a little bit more shallow. So that means that it's not super specific about the orientation, right? So we can like describe very well what is the properties of the neurons just based on the activity profile. Okay. In the example that I prepare from this data, which are like simulated data, of course I will share some script that you can use to simulate your own data and probably train different types of models or try classification or representation of similarity. With this data, if you plot the activity profile for different neurons, here the neuron 1 or neuron 10, you will see that they have different preferences. The neuron 1 has the peak around the 20 degrees, so it's a neuron that is tuned for that orientation. And the neuron 10 instead has like a peak at 60 degrees. So we can see that we can simulate different tuning functions. And in the case of the neuron 30, for example, the tuning is much more flat and it's not clear what is the preference of this neuron, right? So we can see that we can like play around with this type of things just with MATLAB, and you will see how to do it in the future. Then we will move to another property of or another hypothesis about how information can be encoded in the brain, which is the sparse coding. And the sparse coding states that information is, instead of being distributed in an homogeneous way along the neurons in the brain, there are like some neurons that they have like some preferences for some properties of the stimulus. So there are like some few neurons that they like vertical, some other few neurons that they like horizontal, some other. So there are like different tunings for different units. This lead us to the idea of population coding. So when you have like neurons with different tunings, in the end, what we can like propose is that the strategy, the computational strategy that neurons are using in order to encode and decode information from the external world is the population coding strategy or model. So in this case, imagine that you have a lot of neurons and they have so each tuning curve is a neuron or is a channel, let's say, and then we can see how all these neurons that we are maybe recording from one ROI are contributing to the final response. So in the end, what we can measure is a little bit the sum of all the activities of all the channels, right? So that's one of the possibilities of how information is encoded. So that is important because when we look at the brain and we look at the neurons in the brain, there are like activity patterns. So we are not just looking at individual activity profiles, but we are looking at how the information is distributed along different patterns, right? And this is what we have been doing in this course using a representation of similarity. If we apply representation of similarity to these matrices that we have artificially generated, then what we can get with the pattern analysis is an RSA, and what we can see is that a 0 degrees orientation is very similar to a 0 degrees orientation and very dissimilar to for example, 140 degrees. So this is the classical representation of similarity with perfect information representation. And this has been technically decoded from here. So the thing is that when we get the data from the brain and we arrange it in this way, which is what we generally do, we have like a features or sensor features that can be neurons, or they can be voxels, or they can be electrodes. We arrange them here, and then we have the trials. So we can look at the data in many different ways. And what we have to understand is that when we are looking, for example, to the activity profiles, okay, like here, to the vertical profile of activations, what happens is that we are like closer to the neural activity space. We are like closer to the description of how neurons are firing in the brain, and we are a little bit far from the representation space. And the more we scale in the abstract representation, for example, here we can get the geometrical representation space of information as we look at the distance between different representations of external stimuli, till we go to the pattern components analysis, like using a classifier. The more we are like losing the connection with a neural pattern, with a neural information, with the brain, right? So we are like moving from a neural activity space to a stimulus or representational space. So it depends on which are our questions that we have to know, and we have to decide in which space of all of these we want to move around, because then there are like things that we won't be able to see if we are in the activity profile space or we are in the activity pattern space. As it was proposed by Kriegskorn and Rieditsen, the brain can be considered like an onion with different layers, and these layers, they are like actually representing some different levels of abstraction. For instance, in the first and more superficial layer, what we have is the neural locations and the activity profiles, right? This is a very concrete information, is what you directly measure from the brain. Then if we move a little bit in and we peel out the external skin, what we get is the activity profile distributions that then it can be transformed in the representational geometry. So now once we move to the representational geometry, we have already lost track of the activity profile information. We don't know, and we don't need actually to know how the information is distributed across the different sensors or different units, like the voxels of the electrodes. What we care is how the distance, the abstract distance between the different features is represented in the brain. And then once we go to the linear decoders, which are the classifiers, then we are like completely away from structure. We are completely away from geometry. What we just get is the core, is just all that can separate between different stimulus representation. So here in this layer is where we find the pattern information, and what we can use is the supporting vector machine, linear discriminant analysis, naive. So these are different types of classifiers that we can use. You just like give them different classes, and then it will try to maximize the difference between these classes, and that will be the result. And we don't know, it's completely abstract. We don't know what is the connection of these patterns with the real world, right? So maybe we can like try to use the accuracy of the classifier to correlate it with different properties of the task, but we won't know how they actually relate it, and it's very difficult to trace back the relationship between activity patterns and neural phenomena. So some characteristics of these pattern components or these techniques of analysis is that it's using all the information that is available. So if two classes are different, but not because the representation is different, but maybe because the level of attention is different, or maybe because you move the head in a different way in one condition to the other. So the classifier will take all the information available, and we will try to maximize the distance, and then you will see that there is information in the brain that you can use to classify between two, or there is information in the brain or in your recordings, as I said, because you have an artifact that is not related with brain activity, like a movement of the hand or something like that, it will be also be picked by the classifier to classify. Then, as I said, it's discarding single unit contributions. You are just looking at the pattern information. So then you cannot see how the information is spatially distributed in the brain. Only if you use a searchlight technique, but searchlight technique is not telling you too much about how the units are working, but it's just like giving you some kind of description of the multiple units measured together. Then it has the problem that it's difficult to interpret the classifiers, so you don't know what you are classifying. You cannot know what is the classifier classifying. As I said, you don't know if it's attention or it's another feature that is not related with the task that you want to analyze. Then, so the fact that you can classify above chance is not telling you that this information is being used by the brain. So the only thing that you know is that the brain is potentially using that information to classify, right? So that you can classify something doesn't mean that this is information that is being used, right? So this is also interesting to take into account. And then finally, it doesn't provide a functional description of any of the computational processes that are in the brain. You are not modeling the brain. You are just like training an algorithm to maximize the distance between different classes that you have previously predefined. Okay. Then we can look at the next layer, which is the representational geometry. And here we have the distances based in the Mahalanobis, Euclidean or correlation, or even the classifier errors. That's going to tell you distance between the different classes that you want to evaluate. Again, based on pattern activity. So which are the characteristics of this? So it's using neural measurements to project external stimulus of the representations in a geometrical space. That is nice because it's not only saying this and these are different. So it's also telling you these are different, but this and these are more similar than this and this. So in the end, you can like map in a multidimensional space how the information is related with each other. And then you can corroborate these models with the external work when some predefined models. Individual units, as in classifier analysis, are also thrown away, so you don't have access to individual units contributions. Then, as I said, you can test hypotheses if you predefine some a priori dissimilarity models based on some task properties or stimulus properties. You can check, you can search in the brain where these models apply and if they apply. But in the end, it doesn't provide any computational description on how information is represented in the brain. It's basically looking for similarity or dissimilarity. And what is very cool of representation of similarity is that it allows to compare the geometries between different modalities. And when I refer to modalities, I refer to EEG, fMRI, or single cell recordings. And it can also allow you to compare between different individuals or species. For instance, if you are like measuring different distances using representational similarity, you can find some differences. So here in this example, what is being used is the cosine distance, which is based on the phase difference between two vectors, and this is not sensitive to the module of the vector, right? So it's just the degrees of difference. But if you take a Euclidean distance, then you are like considering both things. The module is like scaling up the distance of the red category with respect to in this case, the chair, with respect to the others. So depending on what distant measures you are using, maybe your representational space can slightly change. It's not going to change dramatically, but it can change a little bit. But in the end, what you can get with these techniques is a highly abstract representation of information, because it has been seen that even when you are like getting this information from different species, like a monkey IT, inferotemporal cortex, or a human IT, and then you present them with a lot of different stimuli, different categories, what you can see is that you can directly compare how information is mapped in this geometrical space in both species. And in the end, what you can see is that the mapping is very similar. It's a very similar mapping in the monkey and in the human, and that opens some space to evaluate how representations can change in different stages or different ages, and it's very interesting and very straightforward tool. And finally, we have the specials patterns, which are the most superficial layer of all, the onion, or the complete onion. So when we are looking at this, we are looking at the neurons individually, and we are like throwing away, let's say, the pattern activity. So here we have the tuning function, or the tuning curve. These ones are more accessible to the encoding models, because the encoding model try to reproduce what is happening at the neuron level, or at the unit level. Okay, so they have some advantages and also some disadvantages. The advantages are that the activity can consider for each sensor individually. So this is an advantage, because you can like represent how, for example, in a region of interest, in an ROI, you can like see if the information is distributed along many neurons, or maybe there are like a few group of neurons in some part of the ROI that are really tuned to that particular feature. So this is going to allow you to really investigate from a closer distance what are the properties of this tissue, right? And how the information is distributed there. Spatial information, therefore, is preserved. Also, the interesting thing is that you can build a model assuming how the stimulus should be mapped in neural space. So you know some neurophysiological properties of the tissue in a specific. You can apply this to your model when you want to map the external stimulus to neural activity. And then you can understand which variables are driving the neural activity and how much variance your model is explaining. In the next part of this course, I will go more in detail of the advantages of the forward encoding models and how they work. But by the moment, I think that this is like a general description of the difference between the different levels of representation of information in the brain. So the take-home message of this part of the course is that you should know that when you are looking at representations encoded in patterns, you are peeling apart, you are peeling out the external information. So you are looking more at the core, depending if you are using classifiers, or maybe at the geometry, but you are like missing all the information about the tuning of the individual sensor. So you are more in the representational space, which it can be interesting for you if this is what you want, but you should know what are the limitations of your analysis. On the other hand, when we look at activity profiles, we miss information encoded in patterns. So this is the other side of the coin, right? So you can like miss, the information is not only encoded in one neuron or in one unit, can be encoded in a combination of neurons conforming a pattern, and then this could be missed by an encoding model. Not always, because encoding models also allow multivariate analysis, but it could happen when you look at the activity profiles. Another important thing is that more realistic brain models of information representation should consider what we know about brain organization. So it's not only that we try to classify one information from another. We have to impose some constraints to our model, considering what we know about the brain, right? This way we will really be closer to understand how the brain works, because this is one of the goals that we have, right? So that's why a multivariate pattern analysis techniques maybe are good to understand how the conceptual information is represented in the brain, but maybe it's not really making us to be closer to how the brain actually works. And then another thing that is like a paradoxical and interesting thing to take into account is that when you have information, imagine in this case that you have 3 stimuli. In this case, we can have that you have the same information in this and this condition. And when I refer that you have the same information, is that if you train a classifier, stimulus 1 and stimulus 2 is clearly possible to classify one from the other, but they are more difficult to classify than stimulus 1 from 3 and stimulus 2 from 3. And this is also happening in this other condition, right? So if you will train a classifier, you possibly will get the same accuracies pattern, so you will have the same accuracy in this and this, but you will miss that the geometrical distribution is different. So using a representation of similarity analysis will help you to see this type of things. But for example, in this other scenario, you have a stimulus 1 and a stimulus 2, they are like overlapping a lot, and here the same. So we are like working with linear classifiers. This of course you will be able to classify the stimulus 1 and stimulus 2 from stimulus 3 in both cases. But if you want to classify stimulus 1 from stimulus 2, in this case it's impossible. And in this case it's also impossible if you are using a linear classifier. But if, for example, you use a radial basis classifier or a non-linear classifier, you possibly can classify these two conditions. So this is something that it might happen very often, or more often than we think, in the brain. So we generally assume that everything is linear, but sometimes this situation can occur. As we are using most of the time linear classifiers, we are possibly being unable to say that two stimuli are different, maybe because the representation is non-linearly different. So this should be taken into account for the future. So with this, I think that we can like pass to the next part of the course.